All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival industry events, and thank you so much for joining us. This year our film program will be screened online from September 9th to the 15th with our new media exhibition installed at the Medulla Art Gallery in Woodford in Port of Spain. And if you're joining us via Facebook Live, please feel free to leave any questions you may have in the comment section below. We'll get to them as soon as we can during the session. And don't forget to check out the film listing online at online ttfilmfestival.com. We'd like to thank all of our Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival 20 sponsors. We have our main sponsor, Ministry of Tourism and Culture and the Arts, contributing sponsors, and we also have Shell Trinidad Limited supporting, as well as Republic Bank Limited. So here we're going to speak to Louise Henderson and Olivier Marboeuf, who created this beautiful film called Overtures. So we're just going to have a little chat with them about the film, some of their thoughts, their process. And I just want to start with a question that's been on my mind ever since I learned a little bit about you guys. The Living and the Dead Ensemble. I found that name very interesting. So I was just wondering, like, what is the story behind that?
Big question for the beginning.
Yeah.
I don't really remember, but perhaps Louis could say more than me. But I think in my mind, we were looking for a name for the ensemble, which is a kind of organic process, because we didn't decide at the real beginning to create that ensemble. It's really a kind of organic consequences of our attempt to do a film. And at some point, yeah, I think there is different reason to have the Living and the Dead ensemble, but really in the Haitian context, and I think it's true for all the Caribbean context, there is really that relationship in between being the living and walking with the dead, because Ouverture's God as a point of departure, a kind of journey with a kind of spectrum, which is the spectrum for Toussaint Louverture himself, who is coming back in a certain way to Haiti as a ghost, but with living in a new spiral of the history. But I don't remember exactly why we chose that name. I don't know if Louis, you remember something about that more precisely.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that we did actually. So the film is an adaptation of, obviously, no, it's not. The film is partly about the translation and adaptation of a play by Edouard Glissant, called Monsieur Toussaint. And actually, we did a performance of that play in Port-au-Prince in 2017, which doesn't feature in the film. In the film, we see rehearsals and we see some elements of the play that then starts to become fictionalized and change. But we actually did a performance of the play. And in the play is made up of 4 chapters. And one of the chapters is called The Living, and another chapter is called The Dead, and another chapter is called The People, and another chapter is called The Heroes. And it was from reading through those chapters that we were kind of excited with thinking about what Edouard Glissant wanted to do with his play in terms of, and he calls it a particular Caribbean understanding of the persistence of the dead within the world of the living. And we thought that as a group, that was something we were all pretty much very interested in discussing and following. And then the word ensemble came because we liked to take that from theatre and from music to try and think about how the group we work with is not exactly a collective. We follow collective ways of working, but we don't really consider it as a collective, but more as an ensemble, which obviously in French means together. So we like the idea. It's also a bit of a play on words. The Living and the Dead ensemble could also be read as the living and the dead together. You know.
Now, I like that because typically you won't, you would tend to think that you want to interchange the word collective and ensemble. So I like the fact that this is, by definition, a separation of the two in the way that things have been put together. actually both in the film and in the group that actually puts it together. So I was very intrigued by the name of it. I really like the story that's behind it.
Yeah.
So for me, I guess one of the things I like to ask people is, what was like the main motivation to get something like this out, to tell this particular story from you guys entering into this project?
Do you want to answer that first, Olivier, or me?
Yeah, I can say a few words. I will say that first thing, just to say really that there is a lot of different stories that we can tell about the film. Now where we are, we can consider it as a kind of platform of storytelling. So there is a lot of way to entry in the why of the film, and also from that to go to a lot of different directions. So it's really rich, and the film can be considered not as the end of the process, but really as a center from where we can go in several directions. So I will add about just to try to answer the question, I will add about the term of ensemble, that we can also reflect it as a kind of attempt to create an assembly. We could be a place for debate and reflection and production. And so in certain way, the film is a kind of trace of that attempt to create an assembly. So it's not only a finished object, it's also a kind of, let's say, yeah, a kind of trace of a dynamic that is keeping on at the moment. So I think the project was to try to create those conditions of creating something together, and the film is a kind of testimony of it.
Yeah, and also for me, it was important, you know, I was living in France for 5 years. I was going to say for a very long time, but not that long. I lived in France for 5 years permanently. Now I work a lot in France. Obviously, Olivier and I still work together, and I have a close connection with France. It's a country that helped develop my own intellectual space, as in some respects. And when I was studying there in around 2014, I started reading a lot of Caribbean literature about Haiti and about Haiti's past, but never written by French authors. Or actually, I was reading a lot of English stuff. So I was reading actually C.L.R. James, for example, who's from Trinidad. But also reading, you know, Derek Walcott, who was writing about Toussaint Louverture and Haiti, also Aimé Césaire, people like this. And but then, you know, I was interested how that story of the history of Haiti it was also been written about in the United States of America, being written about by various other people around the globe, but it wasn't something that was spoken about much. This is what I perceived at that time in France. Right. And at that time that I was there suddenly became a sort of reinvigoration of talking about the French Revolution and what the French Revolution stood for in terms of liberty, freedom, and fraternité, liberté, égalité, fraternité, as these sort of universal principles of human rights. And the French people I was talking to at that time, then I would say to them, well, you know, how would you feel if I said that there was a revolution that was 2 years after your famed French Revolution, that perhaps actually really worked quite hard at putting those human rights into actual practice? And they said, what do you mean, where? And I would say Haiti. And people would say, where? What's this? You know, French people. So
but nobody knows still until now. I think it becomes slightly more, but I think it's still really quite unknown, in fact.
And that for me was very interesting, because it wasn't like something had been forgotten. It was obviously, it became more clearer that something had been purposely. It's not that it was unwritten, like it written out. It was never written in to French history in terms of school and education. It's the same thing in England. We're not taught British colonial history in English schools. Maybe nowadays they are more. Anyways, so for me, living in France at that time, I thought an interesting way to think critically about how the French had been writing their own histories, particularly in relationship to the sort of power that they had accrued and wealth from their colonial history. And I thought it was interesting to then, you know, insist on always talking about Haiti and the story of the relation between Toussaint Louverture and Napoleon, and Toussaint Louverture, who lived and died in France. Well, he was imprisoned and died in France. So for me, it was a sort of a kind of provocative gesture to try and think about this. Anyway, that was my personal thing. Then for the group of people we work with in Haiti, they all have very different reasons for being interested in those stories. But I can't speak for them. But yeah.
Perhaps we can add just one thing, is that the gesture of coming the first time in Haiti when we've been there together with Louis in 2017 was also in a certain way the gesture of, let's say, verification of just to understand the place of that myth and the story of the revolution in the mind of the young generation nowadays, because it was a kind of hypothesis at work. And finally, we came there in a certain way to verify if it was not only a phantasma from, let's say, Western gaze, or something really inscribed in the nowadays, I mean, in Haiti, which really was the case much more than we thought, finally.
So, because in the film, we're looking at a group of young, the actors and so forth, is a group of young people who carry the story through for us. So, I kind of wanted to tie that to the way that this looks at the conversations that it can bring. Sometimes, which could be a confrontation of a past that maybe that we are not aware of. And was it 2017 when you guys showed at the Ghetto by Now?
Yeah.
Right. So I thought that was like an interesting space to put that, because here you were saying, like, look, let's look at this story. You can tell me if I read that wrong, but look at the story and let's have a conversation about it. Let's talk about this figure that some people may or may not know, who's very important to a lot of folks today still. Looking at some of the events that happened this year as well with the Black Lives Matter movement, where we are now becoming aware of certain stories, and it helps to have like some of this history being brought back in and looked at. Did any of that cross your minds, like looking at some of those things coming together as the film is out there now?
Yeah, I think, I kind of say just a short thing, just to say that I think the first thing is that really the process of Ouverture have to be shared in the sense of we didn't come here with a really precise idea of how to tell that story. It's really important to understand that the film is really an experimentation of creating a space of our community. And so we didn't know even how to create that space when we've been there first. So it's really the collective experiment is really at that level, saying that we proposed a first practice on the play, and the practice of the plays was also a way to understand each other, who was who. And so it's still an ongoing process. We discover each other, a time of being together. And through that, I do think that what could be connected to what happened in the world, and also all the kind of radical blackness that came now on the agenda, I will say, I will find it in Ouverture in the process of bringing some conversation that really are often side conversation of out of the film, in the film. Considering that the film is a kind of space that got some porosity with what's happening out of the film. So not considering the film is a project we are doing, but it's a way of living together and entering in a lot of different occasions, some conversation that we are more often, let's say, side conversation. And so I would say that what's happening in the world is the same thing for, I think, the Black communities, considering that all the side conversation of Black people came in a kind of scene of representation that used to be more on the side or out of it. It's the same process with the film. They invite in certain way the film.
Okay.
Yeah, and also actually the film originally began, you know, I mean, Olivier and I have been discussing the importance of Haiti and the possibility of making a film in Haiti since 2014. And 2014 was also a year very marked by police violence in the United States that came about with, for example, the very famous, or famously tragic, and the whole series of events that came out after the death of Michael Brown, and the protest in Ferguson that was, I think, one of the, well, now since it's got even worse, but at that point it was a very extreme form of militarization of the police on behalf of the American government at that period. And, you know, and also in Paris at that time, the city had been quite rocked and very badly shaped by a series of attacks that had happened, like with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and also the attacks, I mean, different forms of attack. This wasn't the police attacking, this was people attacking other people. And that was why at that moment in France, because of the attacks at Charlie Hebdo, there had been this reinvigoration of this talk around freedom of speech and the French sort of importance of creating a space for that to happen. And then at that same time, there was also the riots happening in Ferguson. And I was interested to try and think about those riots in Ferguson as having a sort of relationship that went back through history within the afterlife of slavery in the United States of America. And, you know, Haiti stood out for Olivier and I at that time as a kind of symbol or an emblem for some form of revolutionary activity that had brought about a significant change in that respect, in relationship to the violence of plantation capitalism. Like Olivier said, this was a kind of thesis we had, because neither of us had been to Haiti. This was a theoretical proposition. Then we went to Haiti, and, you know, 3 years later, 2017, to meet people and to start the process of trying to say, you know, so these discussions, we've been having these discussions with the group. It doesn't come into the film, but we talk about these kind of subjects all of the time, about police violence towards the community in Haiti, towards the community in, we just had the group of Haitians were in Paris in 2019, because Olivier organized a residency in a neighborhood called Clichy-Montfermeil, which was very famously, very famous riots took place in 2005 against police brutality. You know, so all of these kind of questions and subjects are things that we've been actually tackling with for, you know, some long period. And then it just happens that, unfortunately, these things don't get resolved and they continue. And 6 years after what happened in 2014, we have the same thing happening in the United States again and again and again. So I think the film stays relevant, and it, you know.
Very relevant. So for me, what I thought is interesting, looking at your backgrounds, both of you guys are very experimental. And I guess it shows, because of the way that you've just described, how you've approached the process of presenting the film, putting things together. The conversation with the two women in the group, where they were talking about that women seem to not have been as important in terms of how they were written and that kind of stuff. I thought that was a fascinating thing to have in there. Why did you guys think it was necessary to put that?
I think the point that we have to understand is really that film was a way to know each other. So we see really people that we met. So there is a lot of different conversation that were, as I told you, side conversations. Obviously now we know each other much more, because we spend since the film much more time. And what is super important is that in different contexts, because the film was really a Haitian film in the sense of based on Haiti and about the history of Haiti. And I do think that all the ensemble switched to more, let's say, a Caribbean perspective on the world. So now we are sharing more things coming from different space in the world. But at that time, this conversation was also a way to learn about each person, because it was really a new relationship. So I think the film is not something that comes as a solution or resolution of relationship after a long moment, but we have really to be clear about the fact that the film is a process of creating a kind of kinship between us. But it's not after a process, is really during the process. So the films share really how an assembly creates some common references. And so we try also to consider with Louis what we are not there to create, you know, a kind of really design objects to express something, but let things enter in. And all those conversation was, let's say that kind of side conversation, and the women in the group
Very
are really
organic.
talking. They are really talking a lot about the place of women in the society. It's not only at that moment. It had happened several times. It's really a really central issue for the Haitian society at the moment, especially for women, for young women.
It's also important to say that actually, though scenes like that, for example, just that really came. So Olivier and I, you know, decided to allow the group, obviously. So they are ostensibly actors.
Until we have less than 30 seconds.
Okay,
sorry,
I was just going to say that they write those. Those scenes are written by them. They're things that they decide they want to say, and we feel they're important, and then we let those things happen. So in terms of a director, it's a rather loose way to direct, because you actually allow your actors to, you know, say their own stories, basically.
I wish we had more time, but this was very, very enlightening for me. And I want to go back and take another look at the film with some of the points that we discussed. Thanks so much for sharing your time with me, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.